Alright, we're back. The last installment of Chapter 4 of Love in the Time of Cholera, starting in the middle of page 210. Let's jump right in. Misfortune piled on misfortune, and in the worst of those years, Fermina Daza had to face what was bound to come sooner or later, the truth of her husband's fabulous and always mysterious dealings. The governor of the province made an appointment with Juvenal Urbino in his office to bring him up to date on the excesses of his father-in-law, which he summed up in a single sentence: "There is no law, human or divine, that this man has not ignored." Some of his most serious schemes had been carried out in the shadow of his son-in-law's prestige, and it would have been difficult to believe that he and his wife knew nothing about them. Realizing that the only reputation to protect was his own, because it was the only one still standing, Dr. Juvenal Urbino intervened with all the weight of his prestige, and he succeeded in covering up the scandal with his word of honor, so that Lorenzo Daza left the country on the first boat, never to return. He went back to his native country as if it were one of those little trips one takes from time to time to ward off nostalgia, and at the bottom of that appearance there was some truth. For a long time he had boarded ships from his country just to drink a glass of water from the cisterns filled with the rains of the village where he was born. He left without having his arm twisted, protesting his innocence and still trying to convince his son-in-law that he had been the victim of a political conspiracy. He left crying for his girl, as he had called Fermina Daza since her marriage, crying for his grandson, for the land in which he had become rich and free, and where on the basis of his shady dealings he had won the power to turn his daughter into an exquisite lady. He felt old and sick, but still he lived much longer than any of his victims might have desired. Fermina Daza could not repress a sigh of relief when she received the news of his death, and in order to avoid questions she did not wear mourning, but for several months she wept with mute fury without knowing why, because she locked herself in the bathroom to smoke, and it was because she was crying for him. The most absurd element in their situation was that they never seemed so happy in public as during those first years of misery, for this was the time of their greatest victories over the subterranean hostility of a milieu that resisted accepting them as they were, different and modern, and for that reason transgressors against the traditional order. That, however, had been the easy part for Fermina Daza. Life in the world, which had caused her so much uncertainty before she was familiar with it, was nothing more than a system of atavistic contracts, banal ceremonies, and preordained words, with which people entertained each other in society in order not to commit murder. The dominant sign in that paradise of provincial frivolity was fear of the unknown. She had defined it in a simpler way. The problem in public life is learning to overcome terror. The problem in married life is learning to overcome boredom. She had made this sudden discovery with the clarity of a revelation when, trailing her endless bridal train behind her, she had entered the vast salon of the social club, where the air was thin with the mingled scent of so many flowers, the brilliance of the waltzes, the tumult of perspiring men and tremulous women, who looked at her not knowing how they were going to exorcise the dazzling menace that had come to them from the outside world. She had just turned 21 and had done little more than leave her house to go to school, but with one look around her, she understood that her adversaries were not convulsed with hatred, but paralyzed with fear. Instead of frightening them even more, as she was already doing, she had the compassion to help them learn to know her. They were no different from what she wanted them to be, just as in the case of cities, which did not seem better or worse to her, but only as she made them in her heart. Despite the perpetual rain, the sordid merchants, and the Homeric vulgarity of its carriage drivers, she would always remember Paris as the most beautiful city in the world, not because of what it was or what it was not in reality, but because it was linked to the memory of her happiest years. Dr. Urbino, for his part, commanded respect with the same weapons that were used against him, except that his were wielded with more intelligence and with calculated solemnity. Nothing happened without them. Civic exhibitions, the poetic festival, artistic events, charity raffles, patriotic ceremonies, the first journey in a balloon. They were there for everything, and almost always, from its inception and at the forefront. During those unfortunate years, no one could have imagined anyone happier than they, or a marriage more harmonious than theirs. The house left by her father gave Fermina Daza a refuge from the asphyxiation of the family place. As soon as she could escape from public view, she would go in secret to the Park of the Evangels, and there she would visit with new friends and some old ones from school or the painting classes, an innocent substitute for infidelity. She spent tranquil hours as a single mother, surrounded by what remained of her girlhood memories. She replaced the perfumed crows, found cats on the street, and placed them in the care of Galla Placidia, who by this time was old and somewhat slowed by rheumatism, but still willing to bring the house back to life. She opened the sewing room where Florentino Ariza saw her for the first time, where Dr. Juvenal Urbino had her stick out her tongue so that he could try to read her heart, and she turned it into a sanctuary of the past. One winter afternoon, she went to close the balcony because a heavy storm was threatening, and she saw Florentino Ariza on his bench under the almond trees in the little park, with his father's suit altered to fit him and his book open on his lap. But this time she did not see him as she had seen him by accident on various occasions, but at the age at which he remained in her memory. She was afraid that the vision was an omen of death, and she was grief-stricken. She dared to tell herself that perhaps she would have been happier with him, alone with him in that house she had restored for him, with as much love as he had felt when he restored his house for her, and that simple hypothesis dismayed her because it permitted her to realize the extreme of unhappiness she had reached. Then she summoned her last strength and obliged her husband to talk to her without evasion, to comfort her, to argue with her, to cry with her in rage at the loss of paradise, until they heard the last rooster crow, and the last light filtered in through the lace curtains of the palace, and the sun rose, and her husband, puffy with so much talk, exhausted with lack of sleep, his heart fortified with so much weeping, laced his shoes, tightened his belt, fastened everything that remained to him of his manhood, and told her, yes, my love, they were going to look for the love they had lost in Europe, starting tomorrow and forever after. It was such a firm decision that he arranged with the Treasury Bank, his general administrator, for the immediate liquidation of the vast family fortune, which was dispersed, and had been from the very beginning in all kinds of businesses, investments, and long-term sacred bonds, and which only he knew was not as excessive as legend would have it, just large enough so one did not need to think about it. What there was of it was converted into stamped gold, to be invested little by little in his foreign bank accounts until he and his wife would do nothing in this harsh country, not even plot of ground to die on. Would own nothing in this harsh country, not even a plot of ground to die on. Middle of 213. And yet Florentino Ariza actually existed, contrary to what she had decided to believe. He was on the pier where the French ocean liner was docked when she arrived with her husband and child in the landau drawn by the golden horses, and he saw them emerge as he had so often seen them at public ceremonies. Perfect. They were leaving with their son, raised in such a way that one could already see what he would be like as an adult, and so he was. Juvenal Urbino greeted Florentino Ariza with a joyous wave of his hat. "We're off to conquer Flanders." Fermina Daza nodded, and Florentino Ariza took off his hat and made a slight bow, and she looked at him without the slightest compassion for the premature ravages of baldness. There he was, just as she saw him, the shadow of someone she had never met. These were not the best times for Florentino Ariza either. In addition to his work, which grew more and more intense, and the tedium of his furtive hunting and the dead calm of the years, there was also the final crisis of Transito Ariza, whose mind had been left almost without memories, almost a blank, to the point where she would turn to him at times, see him reading in the armchair he was always sat in, and ask him in surprise, "And whose son are you?" He would always reply with the truth, but she would interrupt him again without delay. "And tell me something, my boy," she asked. "Who am I?" She had grown so fat that she could not move, and she spent the day in the notions shop, where there was no longer anything to sell, primping and dressing in finery, from the time she awoke with the first roosters until the following dawn, for she slept very little. She would put garlands of flowers on her head, paint her lips, powder her face and arms, and at last she would ask whoever was with her, "Who am I now?" The neighbors knew that she always expected the same reply: "You are little Roachi Martinez." This identity stolen from a character in a children's book was the only one that satisfied her. She continued to rock and to fan herself with long pink feathers until she began all over again. The crown of paper flowers, violet on her eyelids, red on her lips, dead white on her face, and again the question to whoever was nearby, who am I now? When she became the laughing-stock of the neighborhood, Florentino Ariza had the counter and the storage drawers of the old notions shop dismantled in one night, and the street door sealed, and the space arranged just as he had heard her describe Rachi Martinez's bedroom, and she never asked again who she was. At the suggestion of Uncle Leo XII, he found an older woman to take care of her, but the poor thing was always more asleep than awake, and at times she gave the impression that she, too, forgot who she was. So the Florentino Ariza would stay home from the time he left the offices until he managed to put his mother to sleep. He no longer played dominoes at the commercial club, and for a long time he did not visit the few women friends he had continued to see, for something very profound had changed in his heart after his dreadful meeting with Olympia Zuleta. It was as if he had been struck by lightning. Florentino Ariza had just taken Uncle Leo XII home during one of those October storms that would leave us reeling, when he saw from his carriage a slight, very agile girl in a dress covered with organza ruffles that looked like a bridal gown. He saw her running in alarm from one side of the street to the other, because the wind had snatched away her parasol and was blowing it out to sea. He rescued her in his carriage and went out of his way to take her to her house, an old converted hermitage that faced the open sea and whose patio, visible from the street, was full of pigeon coops. On the way, she told him that she had been married less than a year to a man who sold trinkets in the market, whom Florentino Ariza had often seen on his company's boats, unloading cartons of all kinds of saleable merchandise, and with a multitude of pigeons in a wicker cage, of the sort mothers used on riverboats for carrying infants. Olympia Zuleta seemed to belong to the wasp family, not only because of her high buttocks and meager bosom, but because of everything around her. Her hair like copper wire, her freckles, her round animated eyes that were farther apart than normal, and her melodious voice that she used not only for saying intelligent and amusing things. Saying intelligent and amusing things. Florentino Ariza thought she was more witty than attractive, and he forgot her as soon as he left her at her house, where she lived with her husband, his father, and other members of his family. Middle of 215. A few days later, he saw her husband at the port loading merchandise instead of unloading it, and when the ship weighed anchor, Florentino heard with great clarity the voice of the devil in his ear. That afternoon, after taking Uncle Leo XII home, he passed by Olympia Zuleta's house as if by accident, and he saw her over the fence, feeding the noisy pigeons. He called to her from his carriage. "How much for a pigeon?" She recognized him and answered in a merry voice. "They are not for sale." He asked, "Then what must I do to get one?" Still feeding the pigeons, she replied, "You drive her back to the coop when you find her lost in a storm." So that Florentino Ariza arrived home that night with a thank-you gift from Olympia Zuleta, a carrier pigeon with a metal ring around its leg. The next afternoon, just after dinner time, the beautiful pigeon fancier saw the gift carrier pigeon in the dovecote and thought it had escaped. But when she picked it up to examine it, she realized that there was a slip of paper inside the ring, a declaration of love. It was the first time that Florentino Ariza had left a written trace, and it would not be the last, although on this occasion he had been prudent enough not to sign his name. He was going into his house and that following afternoon on a Wednesday, when a street boy handed him the same pigeon in a cage, with a memorized message that the pigeon lady hereby sends you this, and says to tell you to please keep the cage locked because if not, it will fly away again, and this is the last time she will send it back. He had no idea how to interpret this. Either the pigeon had lost the note en route, or the pigeon keeper had decided to play innocent, or she had returned the pigeon so that he could send it back to her again. If that was true, however, the natural thing would have been for her to return the pigeon with a reply. On Saturday morning, after much thought, Florentino Ariza sent back the pigeon with another unsigned letter. This time he did not have to wait until the next day. In the afternoon, the same boy brought it back in another cage, with a message that said, she hereby sends back the pigeon that flew away again. And that the day before yesterday she returned it out of courtesy, and this time she returns it out of pity. But that now it is really true that she will not return it again if it flies in it away another time. Transita Ariza played with the pigeon until very late. She took it out of the cage, she rocked it in her arms, she tried to lull it to sleep with children's songs, and then suddenly Florentino Ariza realized that in the ring around its leg was a little piece of paper with one line written on it: "I do not accept anonymous letters." Florentino Ariza read it with his heart wild with joy, as if this were the culmination of his first adventure, and he did not sleep a wink that night as he tossed and turned with impatience. Very early the next day, before he left for the office, he once again set the pigeon free, carrying a love note that bore his clear signature, and he also put in the ring the freshest, reddest, and most fragrant rose from his garden. It was not that easy. After 3 months of pursuit, the beautiful pigeon fancier was still sending the same answer: "I am not one of those women." But she never refused to accept his messages or broke any of those dates that Florentino Ariza arranged so that they would seem to be casual encounters. He was a different person, the lover who never showed his face, the man most avid for love as well as most niggardly with it, the man who gave nothing and wanted everything, the man who did not allow anyone to leave a trace of her sorry. I know that's not a bad word, but it sounds like one that threw me off. Maybe it is. Anyway. Where am I? The man who did not allow anyone to leave a trace of her passing in his heart, the hunter lying in ambush. This man went out on the street in the midst of ecstatic signed letters, gallant gifts, imprudent vigils at the pigeon keeper's house, even on 2 occasions when her husband was not on a trip or at the market. It was the only time since his youngest days when he felt himself run through by the lance of love. 6 months after their first meeting, they found themselves at last in a cabin on a riverboat that was being painted at the docks. It was a marvelous afternoon. Olympia Zoleta had the joyous love of a startled pigeon fancier, and she preferred to remain naked for several hours in a slow-moving repose that was, for her, as loving as love itself. The cabin was dismantled, half-painted, and they would take the odor of turpentine away with them in the memory of a happy afternoon. In a sudden inspiration, Florentino Ariza opened a can of red paint that was within reach of the bunk, wet his index finger, and painted the pubis of the pigeon fancier with an arrow of blood pointing south, and on her belly the words, "This pussy is mine." That same night, Olympia Zoleta undressed in front of her husband, having forgotten what was scrawled there, and he did not say a word. His breathing did not even change, nothing. But he went to the bathroom for his razor, while she was putting on her nightgown, and in a single slash, he cut her throat. Florentino did not find out until many days later, when the fugitive husband was captured and told the newspapers the reasons for the crime and how he had committed it. For many years he thought of the terror of the signed letters. He kept track of the prison term of the murderer, who knew him because of his dealings with the boat company, but it was not so much fear of a knife at his throat or public scandal as the misfortune of Romina Dazo's learning about his infidelity. One day during his years of waiting, the woman who took care of Transita Ariza had to stay at the market longer than expected because of an unseasonable downpour, and when she returned to the house, she found her sitting in the rocking chair, painted and bedecked as always, and with eyes so animated and a smile so mischievous that her caretaker did not realize she was dead until 2 hours later. Shortly before her death, she had distributed to the neighborhood children the fortune in gold and jewels hidden in the jars buried under her bed, saying they could eat them like candy. And some of the most valuable were impossible to recover. Florentino Ariza buried her in the former Hand of God ranch, which was still known as the Cholera Cemetery, and he planted a rose bush on her grave. After the first few visits to the cemetery, Florentino Ariza discovered that Olympia Zoleta was buried very close by, without a tombstone, but with her name and the date scrawled in the fresh cement of the crypt, and he thought in horror that this was one of her husband's sanguinary jokes. When the roses bloomed, he would place a flower on her grave if there was no one in sight, and later he planted a cutting taken from his mother's rosebush. Both bloomed in such profusion that Florentino Ariza had to bring shears and other garden tools to keep them under control. But the task was beyond him. After a few years, the 2 rose bushes had spread like weeds among the graves, and from then on, the unadorned cemetery of the plague was called the Cemetery of Roses, until some mayor, who was less realistic than popular wisdom, cleared out the roses one night and hung a Republican sign from the arch of the entrance gate, Universal Cemetery. The death of his mother left Florentino Ariza condemned once again to his maniacal pursuits, the office, his meetings in strict rotation with his regular mistresses, the domino games at the commercial club, the same books of love, the Sunday visits to the cemetery. It was the rust of routine which he had despised and feared so much, but which had protected him from an awareness of his age. However, one Sunday in December, when the rose bushes in the tombs had already defeated the garden shears, he saw the swallows on the recently installed electric wires, and he suddenly realized how much time had gone by since the death of his mother, and how much time since the murder of Olympia Zaleta, and how very much since that other distant December afternoon, when Fermina Daza sent him a letter saying, yes, she would love him always. Until then, he had behaved as if time would not pass for him, but only for others. Just the week before, he happened to meet on the street one of the many couples who had married because of the letters he had written, and he did not recognize their oldest child, who was his godson. He smoothed over his embarrassment with the conventional exclamation, "I'll be damned, he's a man already," and he continued in the same way even after his body began sending him the first warning signs, because he had always had the iron constitution of the sickly. Transita Ariza used to say, "The only disease my son ever had was cholera." She had confused cholera with love, of course, long before her memory had failed. But in any event, she was mistaken, because her son had suffered from 6 blenorrhegias, although the doctor had said they were not 6, but the same one that reappeared after each lost battle. He also had a swollen lymph gland, 4 warts, and 6 cases of impetigo in the groin. But it would not have occurred to him or any man to think of these as diseases. They were only the spoils of war. When he had just turned 40, he had gone to the doctor because of vague pains in various parts of his body. After many tests, the doctor had said, "It's age." He had returned home without even wondering if any of that had anything to do with him, for his only point of reference in his own past was the ephemeral love affair with Fermina Daza, and only what concerned her had anything to do with reckoning his life. So that on the afternoon when he saw the swallows on the electric wires, he reviewed the past from his earliest memory. He reviewed his chance loves, the countless pitfalls he had been obliged to avoid in order to reach a position of authority, the events without number that had given rise to his bitter determination that Fermina Daza would be his, and he would be hers despite everything, in the face of everything, and only then did he realize that his life was passing. He was shaken by a visceral shudder that left his mind blank, and he had to drop the garden tools and lean against the cemetery wall so that the first blow of old age would not knock him down. "Damn it," he said, appalled. "That all happened 30 years ago." And it had. 30 years that had also gone by for Fermina Daza, of course, but had been for her the most pleasant and exhilarating years of her life. The days of horror in the palace of Casalduero were relegated to the trash heap of memory. She was living in her new house in La Manga, absolute mistress of her own destiny, with a husband she would have preferred to all the men in the world if she had to choose again, a son who was continuing the family tradition in the medical school, and a daughter so much like her when she was her age that at times she was disturbed by the impression of feeling herself duplicated. She had returned to Europe 3 times after the unfortunate trip from which she had intended never to return, so that she would not have to live in perpetual turmoil. God must have finally listened to someone's prayers. After 2 years in Paris, when Fermina Daza and Juvenal Urbino were just beginning to find what remained of their love in the ruins, a midnight telegram awoke them with the news that Doña Blanca de Urbino was gravely ill, and almost on its heels came another with the news of her death. They returned without delay. Fermina Daza walked off the ship wearing a black tunic whose fullness could not hide her condition. In fact, she was pregnant again, and this news gave rise to a popular song, more mischievous than malicious, whose chorus was heard for the rest of the year. What do you think she does over there, this beauty from our earth? Whenever she comes back from Paris, she's ready to give birth. Despite the vulgarity of the words, for many years afterward, Dr. Juvenal Urbino would request it at the social club dances to prove he was a good sport. Top of 220. The noble palace of the Marquis de Casal Duardo, whose existence and coat of arms had never been documented, was sold to the municipal treasury for a decent price, and then resold for a fortune to prove that the real grave of Christopher Columbus was located there, the 5th one so far. The sisters of Dr. Urbino, without taking vows, went to live in seclusion in the convent of the Salesians, and Fermina Daza stayed in her father's old house until the villa in La Manga was completed. She walked in with a firm step. She walked in prepared to command, with the English furniture brought back on their honeymoon and the complimentary furnishings they sent for after their reconciliation trip. And from the first day she began to fill it with exotic animals that she herself went to buy on the schooners from the Antilles. She walked in with the husband she had won back, the son she had raised with propriety, the daughter who was born 4 months after their return, and whom they baptized Ophelia. Dr. Urbino, for his part, understood that it was impossible to possess a wife as completely as he had on their honeymoon, because of the part of love he wanted was what she had given, along with her best hours to her children, but he learned to live and be happy with what was left over. The harmony they had longed for reached its culmination when they least expected it, at a gala dinner at which a delicious food was served that Fermina Daza could not identify. She began with a good portion, but she liked it so much that she took another of the same size, and she was lamenting the fact that urban etiquette did not permit her to help herself to a third when she learned that she had just eaten, with unsuspected pleasure, 2 heaping plates of pureed eggplant. She accepted defeat with good grace, and from that time on, eggplant in all its forms was served at the villa in La Manga with almost as much frequency as the palace of Casal Duardo, and it was enjoyed so much by everyone that Dr. Juvenal Urbino would lighten the idle hours of his old age by insisting that he wanted to have another daughter, so that he could give her the best loved word in the house as a name, Eggplant Urbino. That's too good. Fermina Daza knew that the private life, unlike the public life, was fickle and unpredictable. It was not easy for her to establish real differences between children and adults, but in the last analysis she preferred children because their judgment was more reliable. She had barely turned the corner into maturity, free at last of illusions, when she began to detect the disillusionment of never having been what she had dreamed of being when she was young, in the Park of the Evangels. Instead, she was something she never dared admit even herself, a deluxe servant. In society, she came to be the woman most loved, most catered to, and by the same token most feared, but in nothing was she more demanding or less forgiving than in the management of her house. She always felt as if her life had been lent to her by her husband. She was absolute monarch of a vast empire of happiness, which had been built by him and for him alone. She knew that he loved her above all else, more than anyone else in the world, but only for his own sake. She was in his holy service. If anything vexed her, it was the perpetual chain of daily meals, for they not only had to be served on time, they had to be perfect, and they had to be just what he wanted to eat, without his having to be asked. If she ever did ask, in one of the innumerable useless ceremonies of their domestic ritual, he would not even look up from the newspaper and would reply anything. In his amiable way, he was telling the truth, because one could not imagine a less despotic husband. But when it was time to eat, it could not be anything, but just what he wanted, and with no defects. The meat should not taste of meat, and the fish should not taste of fish, and the pork should not taste of mange, and the chicken should not taste of feathers. Even when it was not the season for asparagus, it had to be found, regardless of cost, so that he could take pleasure in the vapors of his own fragrant urine. She did not blame him, she blamed life. but he was an implacable protagonist in that life. At the mere hint of a doubt, he would push aside his plate and say, "This meal has been prepared without love." In that sphere, she would achieve moments of fantastic inspiration. Once he tasted some chamomile tea and sent it back, saying only, "This stuff tastes of window." But she and the servants were surprised because they had never heard of anyone who had drunk boiled window. But when they tried the tea in an effort to understand, they understood. It did taste of window. He was a perfect husband. He never picked up anything from the floor or turned out a light or closed a door. In the morning darkness, he found a button missing from his clothes. She would hear him say, "A man should have 2 wives, one to love and one to sew on his buttons." Every day, at his first swallow of coffee and at his first spoonful of soup, he would break into a heart-rending howl that no longer frightened anyone, and then unburden himself. "The day I leave this house, you will know it is because I grew tired of always having a burned mouth." He would say that they never prepared lunches as appetizing and unusual as on the days when he could not eat, because he had taken a laxative, and he was so convinced that this was treachery on the part of his wife that in the end he refused to take a purgative unless she took one with him. Tired of his lack of understanding, she asked him for an unusual birthday gift, that for one day he would take care of the domestic chores. He accepted in amusement, and indeed took charge of the house at dawn. He served a splendid breakfast, but he forgot that fried eggs did not agree with her, and that she did not drink café con leche. Then he ordered a birthday luncheon for 8 guests, and gave instructions for tidying the house, and he tried so hard to manage better than she did, that before noon he had to capitulate without a trace of embarrassment. From the first moment he realized he did not have the slightest idea where anything was, above all in the kitchen, and the servants let him upset everything to find each item, for they were playing the game too. At 10 o'clock, no decisions had been made regarding lunch because the house cleaning was not finished yet. The bedroom was not straightened, the bathroom was not scrubbed. He forgot to replace the toilet paper, change the sheets, and send the coachman for the children, and he confused the servants' duties. He told the cook to make the beds, and sent the chambermaids to cooking. At 11 o'clock, when the guests were about to arrive, the chaos in the house was such that Fermina Daza resumed command, laughing out loud, not with the triumphant attitude she would have liked, but shaken instead with compassion for the domestic helplessness of her husband. He was bitter as he offered the argument he always used. "Things did not go as badly for me as they would for you if you tried to cure the sick." But it was a useful lesson, and not for him alone. Over the years, they both reached the same wise conclusion by different paths. It was not possible to live together in any other way, or love in any other way, and nothing in this world was more difficult than love. In the fullness of her new life, Fermina Daza would see Florentino Ariza on various public occasions, with more frequency as he improved his position, but she learned to see him with so much naturalness that more than once, in sheer distraction, she forgot to greet him. She heard about him often, because in the world of business, his cautious and inexorable advance in the RCC was a constant topic of conversation. She saw him improve his manners, his timidity was passed off as a certain enigmatic distance. A slight increase in weight suited him, as did the slowness of age, and he had known how to handle his absolute baldness with dignity. The only area in which he persisted in defying time and fashion was his somber attire, his anachronistic frock coats, his unique hat, the poet's strings tied from his mother's notion shop, his sinister umbrella. Fermina Daza grew accustomed to seeing him with other eyes, and in the end she did not connect him to the languid adolescent who would sit and sigh for her under the gusts of yellow leaves in the Park of the Evangels. In any case, she never saw him with indifference, and she was always pleased by the good news she heard about him, because that helped to alleviate her guilt. However, when she thought he was completely erased from her memory, he reappeared where she least expected him, a phantom of her nostalgia. It was during the first glimmering of old age, when she began to feel that something irreparable had occurred in her life, whenever she heard thunder before rain. It was the incurable wound of solitary, stony, punctual thunder that would sound every afternoon in October at 3 o'clock in the Sierra Villanueva. a memory that was becoming more vivid as the years went by. While more recent events blurred in just a few days, the memories of her legendary journey through Cousin Hildebrand's province were as sharp as if they had happened yesterday, and they had the perverse clarity of nostalgia. She remembered Manuare in the mountains, its one straight green street, its birds of good omen, the haunted house where she would wake to find her nightgown soaked by the endless tears of Petra Morales, who had died of love many years before in the same bed where she lay sleeping. She remembered the taste of the guavas, which had never been the same again, the warning thunder, which had been so intense that its sound was confused with the sound of the rain, the topaz afternoons in San Juan de Cesar, when she would go walking with her court of excited cousins and clench her teeth so that her heart would not leap out of her mouth as they approached the telegraph office. She had to sell her father's house because she could not bear the pain of her adolescence, the view of the desolate little park from the balcony, the sibylline fragrance of gardenias on hot nights, the frightening face of an old lady on the February afternoon when her fate was decided, and, regardless of where she turned her memories of those times, she would find herself face to face with Florentino Ariza. But she always had enough serenity to know that they were not memories of love or repentance, but the image of a sorrow that left a trail of tears on her cheeks. Without realizing it, she was menaced by the same trap of pity that had been the downfall of so many Florentino Ariza's defenseless victims. She clung to her husband, and it was just at the time when he needed her the most, because he suffered the disadvantage of being 10 years ahead of her as he stumbled alone through the mists of old age, with the even greater disadvantage of being a man and weaker than she was. In the end, they knew each other so well that by the time they had been married for 30 years, they were like a single divided being, and they felt uncomfortable at the frequency with which they guessed each other's thoughts without intending to, or the ridiculous accident of one of them anticipating in public what the other was going to say. Together they had overcome the daily incomprehension, the instantaneous hatred, the reciprocal nastiness, and fabulous flashes of glory in the conjugal conspiracy. It was the time when they loved each other best, without hurry or excess, when both were most conscious of and grateful for their incredible victories over adversity. Life would still present them with other mortal trials, of course, but that no longer mattered. They were on the other shore. And that is the end of chapter 4.